I considered early in my career that what I was always doing is slaying another dragon.
Hi, and welcome to Architecting. This is the show where we look at the word architect and as a verb, the act of architecting and the people and the stories behind the buildings and the images. Beyond this, we live in a very interconnected international world where we kind of hear from the same people over and over. And so this show will purposely be local and focused on one community, on Denver. I'm Adam Wagner. I'm a Denver-based architect, married to an architect, have 2 architecture degrees from Kansas State and Yale. I've worked for architecture firms in Wichita, Kansas City, Rotterdam, New Haven, Mexico City, and now Denver for the last 5 years, where I work at Open Studio Architects and also teach at CU Denver. So I've been rooted in this community for the last 5 years and just talk and connect with architects that inspire me and that I think are doing great work. And so I've decided to start recording these and broadcasting them. So that brings us to today with our guest, Stephen Dynia. We're going live with Stephen right now, joining us. But Stephen founded Dynia Architects in 1994. He received a degree in fine arts and architecture from the Rhode Island School of Design, RISD, and then was a senior designer at the New York office of SOM. Until he created his firm in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and then started a firm in Denver in 2007 as well. Needless to say, he's a very award-winning architect. The firm has won over 40 awards, especially within AIA, Colorado, and Wyoming, including the Firm of the Year in Wyoming in 2008. He was awarded the silver medal in 2017. He was also named to the AIA College of Fellows in 2013 and teaches at CU Denver as well. So let's see. We'll get him in here. And there's the man himself. How's it going?
Good afternoon.
So we have Stephen here.
Thank you for inviting me to do this.
Well, thanks for joining. I think you were just on another interview, weren't you?
Yeah. It was Ray Rinaldi from the Post, and we were giving him a tour of the new cabin micro housing.
Oh, nice.
Project on the taxi campus. So, it's interesting because I like critics that are, they don't eat up everything you tell them. They ask questions, and you have to effectively influence them by explaining the meaning behind the moves that you've made and why the building is what it is and why the spaces are what they are and why it fits in culturally to the fabric of Denver and more immediately the campus. So that was fun.
Nice. Where they give you a little bit of pushback. And
yeah, he's always engaging. When I did an interview with him on the Source Hotel, he was a little cool to it, right? And then as I explained the reasons for the shifting of the floors, he sort of warmed up to it, but through a series of intelligent questions that were meaningful, that he asked the right questions to enable me to explain it or to help a better understanding of the project. So this was the same way. There's a little bit of a negative connotations to connotation to the idea of micro housing. You know, it got a bit of a bad rep as something that, you know, developers would just make the spaces smaller and change and charge the same amount of money, right? But I mean, in this case, it added 200 units to the taxi campus, and they're, you know, renting for, I mean, they're like 450 square feet, and they're renting for $1,200 or $1,300 a month, you know, which allows somebody to have their own space, especially, you know, though the thing was planned pre-pandemic, it sort of opened at the right time.
Yeah, I mean that's funny, right? Yeah, my wife and we've lived in apartments of 250 square feet and 350 square feet for 4 years, you know, and you can do it if they're done well.
No, I know. But, I mean, you know, I will tell you that in New York City, you know, but Denver is not New York City, you know. I lived in the West Village in 350 square feet, and it was great, you know. But
yeah,
you know, it's a slightly different context, right?
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, let's get into that. So, I think I like to start this off with, you know, I gave the kind of rote introduction that's based off your website and regurgitated that, but I want to see who would you say you are? So what's your kind of 2-line bio, if you had to say?
Well, if you want to know who I am, you're going to have to ask my therapist.
Nice.
I read that question and thought about, you know, how I've basically spent a life in architecture from a fairly young age. And so, you know, it is my greatest pleasure and my greatest torture, but it is kind of the core of what I am and what I do.
Yeah.
And some people might call that an imbalanced life, but be that as it may, you know, I've come to a point in my career, you know, I think that careers are interesting because I think they, you know, I mean, some people are very confident to start, but, you know, architects take a long time to ripen. And, you know, it's a late blooming profession often for many people. And I feel like the growth of confidence over all of my experiences have led me to a comfortable place in relationship to the work that I do, to the contributions and interaction with our built environment. And I could finally use a comic phrase that I've used since, I don't know, maybe I was 50, to identify the passage of time, which is a quote from an interview with Mel Brooks, where he says, "I went out, I got a prune Danish, I come back and I'm 65. Right? Well, next month I will be 65. I'm going to go out and get a prune Danish. I'm going to come back and say, I went out and got a prune Danish, and I came back and I'm 65. You know,
nice.
I mean,
as long as you don't come back and you're 75, you're all right.
Yeah, exactly. But, I know. I mean, Mel's got to be in his 90s now. So.
Yeah. So let's talk about. I like that imbalance. So let's talk about how that imbalance started. So, how'd you start off? Where are you from? And how'd you get into it?
You know, I'm going to give you a little bit of a short version of the steps and eras, and then kind of go back and dig into them a little more. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's great.
So, you know, when I was a kid, I was very three-dimensional. Like, I would make spaces under dining tables, and, you know, felt like my imagination was three-dimensional, that it was spatial, you know, and you don't know that when you're a kid, right? But in retrospect, you know, when I was in high school and said to somebody I wanted to be an architect, they said, "Well, you can't, you're terrible at math." Yeah. And, you know, it's like, well, so what? You know? Yeah. I mean, but, you know, I grew up in New Haven, and New Haven is a very interesting architectural environment. There are buildings by Eero Saarinen. There are buildings by most of the noted architects of mid 20th century.
Lucan, yeah.
I mean, the first and last Lucan building, plus it spawned an entire, from Yale University, sort of second tier, somewhat known architects. But, there's a SOM, Gordon Bunshaft Rare Book Library. There's Paul Rudolph and his brutalist everything, and others. So, I had this sort of awareness. I remember, I think I was in high school when the Kahn last building, the British Art Museum, was being completed, and sort of knew things that were going on in architecture from a case. Well, let me tell you how it started. I went to a high school. Often in the late 60s, there were high schools in progressive cities that were considered high schools without walls, and they were unconventional education. And I had been 2 years in a public high school, and then chosen by lottery to be part of this program where we had, our main office was in the basement of a girdle factory, and we got gym credit for walking to school in the morning. But they had a program called the Community Participation Program, where they would get professionals from the community to commit to bringing in students, several times a week. And there was an architect who did that. And I would go in and, 1 week he would talk about history and ancient history and recent history. And, that sort of whetted my appetite. It was the early 70s. And I have to say, I wasn't entirely academically inclined early on. But, it was an unconventional education. So the things we gained in like the cultural progressiveness have stayed with me my whole life. The sort of meaningful relationships with teachers, and there were no grades given, the pass-fail situation, and you got to critique your instructor, and this was an era when New Haven had Bobby Seale and the Black Panthers and Angela Davis and, things going on in Yale and a real heated opposition to the Vietnam War. And so that education, I would say that conventionally it wasn't great because you could get away with a lot of things, as far as how many papers you write and whatever else. But it did give me something of an independent means of thinking, and a bigger vision of looking at the world. And so when I left there, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And I happened to get a job at an architect who had spun off of Eero Saarinen's firm. Eero Saarinen started or moved his office from Michigan to New Haven in 1961, and he died of a brain aneurysm or whatever soon after. And there was a firm that didn't get top billing, and after 5 years he left and started his own practice. So it was an interesting firm because it carried a lot of the traditions of Eero Saarinen's office. One was the use of large-scale models on every project. So I became a model builder for that firm, and the first thing I worked on was the restaurant on the top of the original World Trade Center, Windows on the World. So this was kind of a exciting thing. I got to go to one of the openings, but we did models that were 3/4 to an inch, and we would put them on tables and cut holes in the tables so the principal, Warren Plattner, could put his head up and feel the space. Right, this is before digital magic came around. But he also had an industrial design department, and he's more known for his furniture designs, which are still Knoll manufactured. I got probably more than anything out of the industrial design department, this kind of can-do figuring out how to make things, and so I didn't have any resources to really go to architecture school, but I still applied to, after a few years, to a number of places, and the two of them, the two sort of best ones that I got into was Rhode Island School of Design and Cooper Union, and Cooper Union was free, and Rhode Island School of Design was well out of my reach until they called me and said, we miscalculated our financial aid and we're offering 5 of you full scholarships.
Wow.
So then I had this terrible decision to make. I was excited about moving to New York. And I chose RISD, I liked the fact that their studios were open longer and all 24 hours a day near the end of the semester. And Cooper Union was sort of, it didn't have quite that culture, although
really?
It was a great, the studios closed at like 10:30, every night. And at that time, there were a lot of borough students, and they would just go home. And so, that sense of living in the studio and being there till 2 a.m. every night and getting what you get from your fellow students, I felt more of a connection with that at my tours of RISD and my speaking to students that were there and faculty. So, that was kind of an interesting culture shock. I had a different background. I was a couple of years older, but, and I had a background working for a firm. But the firm that I had worked for had sort of different architectural sensibilities than what I was learning at RISD. But the thing I remember from RISD is, it's very focused on conceptual issues, but also very focused on craft. So it's really about the making of things as it is about the thinking of things, and going through that. I mean, there's, there's just memories of an incredibly rigorous process of and it was a 5-year program, right? So 5-year programs were more common back in that era, and they were very intense. Like you had 5 years of studios.
Yeah,
really. And we used to go to Brown. They had their liberal arts program was not, really robust. So we were able to take Brown courses at Brown University for writing and other things. But the crafting of objects and surfaces that we learned at RISD always stuck with me.
Yeah.
So
when I think it's, when I think back to like interesting time periods for interesting programs, like I think of RISD, especially in like those late 60s with like the Talking Heads kind of starting up, and there's all this crazy stuff going on, and like, right. And and Cooper Union definitely has some of that in the early 70s too, I think. But what was that like at that time? Was that some crazy stuff going around? Are you seeing like the art kind of students and things, or?
Well, there were crazy things being done for projects. One sculpture student had taken the main street of the campus, and this tells you about the resources that students had there. They completely sodded it over, right? And so they changed the entire the acoustics of this campus by covering the pavement for like 2 weeks or something, right? But I'll give you an example of the challenge that RISD students would put on the community. The police in Providence, I think this was the year before I went there, and David Byrne preceded me by only a few years.
Oh, really? Yeah.
The whiff of him was still pungent in the time I was there. Everybody wearing, like, for the crit, skinny black tie, white shirt, skinny lapel black jacket, right? This is a whole look, but what the town of Providence, the city, had passed an ordinance that there was not to be any nudity in art exhibits. And so the first thing that all the RISD students did was take Polaroids of their genitals and do an art show. And it was a big controversy. I don't know exactly how that all turned out, but it was kind of the attitude of RISD in terms of challenging what was considered the norm. And if I think of how to put the one thing that RISD taught me was how to see things in a different way, and both accommodate your own unique viewpoint of the world, and always question the conventional considerations of things, right? And so, I think that was the biggest thing that they collectively tried to train you to do. It was like the whole faculty, without even maybe fully realizing it, was on that same page, that they really challenged you to question the conventions of art and society.
So then how did that translate to go into SOM after that? It seems like a little friction, or yeah.
So like SOM used to be the IBM of architecture firms.
Yeah.
That we really all did wear white shirts and ties, and gray suits, daily. And it was still, in the 80s, it still had that whiff of Mad Men culture. The partners' offices had bars and, the liquor cabinets, and, you could smoke in the studio, right? And I think what, and this I would give as advice to students, that there is a lot to learn from a point of departure, of going to a big firm where there are systems in place, and maybe not the idiosyncrasy of, a small firm that may do things in a certain way. At SOM, there was, there was in some way, it was like a corrupting influence. But, when I would go to a cocktail party and give somebody my SOM card, they would immediately know whatever discipline they were in, what SOM is, So, like instant, and the idea of doing tall buildings around the world, and I had gigs in London and in San Francisco, but I was based in New York. And, those were really fun times.
Yeah.
I lived in the West Village, and the clubs that were still around at that point, like the Palladian Ballroom and, all of this stuff. But, it was a very active, absorptive part of my experience. It was in New York, you have to do your hardest to edit out things so you're not so overwhelmed, because there's so much going on. Right? And that's very different than other experiences in other places. But, SOM was part of that world for me, where, it was a little bit arrogant, let's build them tall, it's sort of a conquering attitude. And was, the bigness of it was enjoyable for a period of time. It was compelling when I think back to it. I then came, and I mean, there's lots of stories from SOM. I mean, SOM was a politically very hard place to survive. I mean, you needed like, armor and weapons, because, I mean, there were people that, it was ambitious, but, I will say about the whole experience of being at SOM and being in New York, what I loved about New York is that it made you feel small. And there's a beautiful aspect of making you feel small, because then it makes the world feel enormous. And in SOM, I could look to the right of me, and I worked in the design department, so I mean we would do an impeccable set of DD drawings, and the technical department would come in and begin to work with us and work out curtain wall details and other things. But there were people more talented than me. There were people less talented than me, and it sort of gives you a very fair understanding of the world of architecture, and what expectations are. And I learned so much from my friends at SOM, many of whom I still keep in touch with, and I have a desk in New York that it's not always manned, but it's a small space that I use for some work over there, but also for meeting clients that I may be doing houses for in Jackson Hole, but they're in New York. This sense of being in New York was very exciting, and it sort of started to wind down during the recession of '91, where there was the market crash in '87, but it recovered. There was still a lot of work being done, and we were doing towers in New York, and every one of them, like, their financing fell apart. They had Japanese money behind them at the time, and SOM went from, like, I don't know, 450 to like 160 or something, right?
Wow.
They just didn't need the production, and but a place that is that politically charged is challenging in good times, and it gets increasingly difficult as work becomes more sparse and people are trying to hold on to their position. And it really was a point where I thought, I loved New York and I never wanted to leave New York, but I just started to remember my education and I always thought an architect is really, so multi-talented or needs multiple skills, right? I mean, you have to be somewhat of a business person, or you have to be somewhat of a PR person. You have to be, a technician. You have to be manager, and a designer. And at SOM, I was in the design department, and everything was departmental. The thing you needed went to a whole department that did it. And so I started to think about other possibilities, and I visited Jackson Hole, visiting a friend, and went. It was funny actually, because the year before I was working in the San Francisco office for 6 months, and they offered me a position in that office, and I said, I don't know, can I live in some place as small as San Francisco compared to New York? And then like a year and a half later, I'm packing up my stuff and moving to Jackson Hole. But the reason for doing it is that when I visited there really wasn't anyone doing modern work. Everything was log or national park architecture or arts and crafts kind of work, right? And, some of it was nicely done, but, I was more intrigued by the history of the Mies van der Rohe house in Jackson Hole, and that became my point of departure for, considering, most people that were practicing architecture there considered the log cabin as the point of origin of architecture in that community, and I looked at it as, people buy these lots for $3 million, they build a $5 million house, and, they end up with little divisions in their windows, right? And so the excitement about thinking about a different kind of architecture that opened up to the landscape and, had fluid relationships to the landscape. And this was in the mid-'90s, so, it was not really being practiced, and it took a while to get traction.
Yeah.
To convince people to do this, and it was very hard to do it back then because, you could do it with clients who were not in a formal subdivision because the subdivision required roof pitches and, you couldn't do flat roofs and, you had all sorts of restrictions. So, going through those things, like I just thought of one other tidbit from the time working with Warren Flatner. There was the recession of 1977, I think. It was Jimmy Carter's late 70s, where his office went from 52 people to 8 people. And as those people, I was still an untrained architect, right? I had not gone to school yet. And as those people left, they looked at me and they said, "Are you sure you want to do this? Is this really what you want to do?" And honestly, I've lived through, numerous recessions in my period of my career, and I felt the pain, and I had to get rid of people and, all the things that make it unpleasant. But so, if you could imagine the environment in New York, and why I brought up this notion of New York as a place where you almost have to frame the things you want to do and exclude the other things. It's also a place where nature is contained by the fabric of the city.
Yeah.
And I moved to a place that was the exact inverse and contrast. And that is sort of what got me interested in it, because it was actually contrast in a number of ways. If you think of, I felt like when I went to Jackson Hole, I introduced anxiety to a very sedate community. Like you better not give the finger to somebody at the traffic light, the one traffic light, because you're going to be standing next to them getting a cup of coffee 10 minutes later, right? So, that contrast of density, was so startling. And also the fact that architecture became fully three-dimensional for me. Like you knew what the south side of a building was. I mean, it was a study of environmental phenomena. In terms of everything from wind to terrain to to everything, and it just was very fascinating to embark on that. And when I got traction, I never really intended on staying there as long as I did. But when I got traction, it became too intriguing, because one project would lead to another, and the next client would allow a degree of boldness that the former client didn't quite do, and when I ended up, you really have to develop a body of work, right?
Yeah.
Before you could convincingly go to somebody and say, I know how to do this for you, So when I did build up, enough of a portfolio, and again,
how long did that take?
There were, well, it took 5 years.
Yeah.
At least, and because I moved there in the mid '90s, and the first really interesting modern house where the client had full confidence in me to do this project. They had never had a modern house, and they just said, do what you think needs to be done, and it was a bold house because it was a sort of, it was a house that had a misalignment of the building envelope and the structure. So on the southeast side, it had slabs of concrete every 16 feet. And on the northwest side, it had columns of concrete every 16 feet. But the north side was external and the south side was internal. And so
which house is that?
It's called the Frame House on my website. And it is, it's almost like a bread slicer. It's these wooden trusses, semi-embedded in the ceiling, and this structural grid every 16 feet, and it was like, okay, that was really an SOM idea, because SOM, doing vertical buildings, you can start with a structural idea. If you look at the Hancock building in Chicago, as the braced frame, or the Sears Tower as bundled tubes,
Right.
The form came out of the idea about structure. And so that was a little bit embedded in my thinking. But also that house has a kind of determination that, I don't mean this to sound, it was influenced by Louis Kahn also, because, when I think of the two architects that really intrigued me out of the 20th century in the United States, it was Louis Kahn, because his work, everything he did looks like it will last 1,000 years.
Yeah.
It looks like it's somewhere between a building and a ruin, and it's just so authoritative, yet communicative with its context and its uses, And he had a special ability to do that, from, Dhaka and Bangladesh, right, to the stuff in India, to, his work in the United States. And so it is the permanence and timelessness of his work that always really, it influenced me. And then the other architect was Eero Saarinen, because, he died, he was like 51 when he died. And, he already had lines of furniture and, major buildings, but the buildings were never derivative from each other. He was doing Bell Labs, or
the Ford headquarters,
headquarters. So, at the same time that he was doing TWA and Dulles, So, I find an honorability in that inventiveness, where you're not looking to repeat yourself. You're really looking to discover new things, and just think of doing the TWA terminal and the anxiety that must, you couldn't model everything, You actually built models, to try to replicate the forces, right? But,
So how did that feel, like having those images in your head, coming from SOM, and then being in Jackson for 5 years? And what are you doing? You beating your head on the wall, like doing projects that you don't really believe in, or like, was there?
It's incremental.
Yeah.
Right. So, let's say the first things I got were, more smaller houses or additions, and you just kind of push the envelope, not against the will of an owner, but, in their interest. You're using your authority or your skill to do things that are unexpected from the standpoint of the client, but pleasantly unexpected. And so, it could be as simple as, doing somebody's family room and, making it feel like a pavilion, or something that changed the dynamic of how architecture was seen as buildings with walls that had windows in them. Which is the Meet Mandaroe project intrigued me so much, because it was a glass pavilion over a creek, and Nice, who did collages of many of his projects, they would usually be collages of the exterior of a building on the backdrop of a city. This was actually just a line of a ceiling and a line of a floor and a view, So it subordinated the architecture to the landscape in what I thought was, a magical way. But back to Saarinen, so I have this tangle with Saarinen, because when I worked at Warren Flatman's office, he had taken many people from the remains of Saarinen's office. 5 years after he died, the name changed, and so I was very familiar with Saarinen because of those connections, and I was very familiar with Kahn because of the New Haven work. But the way I would think about it is, not linearly along. Although I will say that when I give presentations, I do um, focus on some buildings that I've done, that houses that are just simple linear buildings, that have different structural systems and different spatial proportions. But it also led me to do some things that were way on the other direction in terms of complexity of form, and so that little part of it came from my admiration for Saarinen. The frame house and some of the simplicity of some of the other houses, were from inspiration from Kahn, but so doing these things one by one, thinking about what I would want to do, and often it would get discouraging, because you start a practice, you've got to pay your bills.
Yeah.
And I resisted, and really every other architect. I mean, there was maybe one other person doing some, interesting things, but it was, I could have, if I wanted to make money, I would have just capitulated and, designed log houses.
Yeah.
Because 99% of the people wanted it. But, I looked at the opportunity as, where people looked at it as a kind of pioneer nostalgia. I looked at the West as a frontier for new ideas, and I had a tenacity that just stayed with it, that I was not going to capitulate to that kind of stuff, that I had a mission to accomplish, which was, to do really good houses for people, but also, to change the community's view of architecture. And the biggest way I did that was as the design architect for the Performing Arts Center in Jackson Hole, which, that was 2007 that it opened, right? And that's when I thought, it's never going to get any better than this. I mean, as architects, we love to do public buildings, right? I would say that we feel, like if you get a museum or a library or, arts building or something, it's pretty thrilling. So that's when I connected with Denver. And because I had so much international travel, I wanted a hub in Denver because I was tired of getting stranded in Jackson and, the insane flight courses to get places. And I did travel often back to New York and, to Europe and Asia. But, I thought, I don't know. I remember. Yeah. So Will Bruder was doing work on the taxi development. And, he called me and this was before the crash. And he said, there's a freight building, a truck freight building from the 50s that they want to redo into office space. And so he, was going to work on another building here, and he had work in Saudi Arabia, and his office was, I think, quite busy at the time. So, I did this, and then the whole world stopped during the middle of that project. But it allowed me to develop this relationship with the Zeppelins and try to, have them understand the value that a designer brings, and they are developers that I've been working with for 12 years, over 12 years now, and, the thing I like about them is that they're not linear, necessarily, and the processes are always interesting and interactive, but they are really curious to explore different things. I mean, they repeat a few things like the garage doors on upper floors, and but all of the buildings that we've done, Zeppelin Station, the hotel, flight, freight residences, Drive 1, Drive 2, the cabin building, they have their own vibe. And so, I jumped in a way, I still have a really good office in Jackson, and I have great people working with me. and great people running that office, you know, and I go back and forth. But which was a good idea, given that, you know, probably the biggest market for architecture right now is in high-end houses.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't have the sort of nobility of doing public buildings, but, you know, after I did that Performing Arts Center, also then, you know, the modern vocabularies were being more embraced in Jackson, so it wasn't as much of a dare, you know, doing, you know, pushing the envelope a little bit, right? And so the opportunity in Denver just kept, when the crash kind of quieted down, and Denver kind of came roaring out of it, and Rhino, you know, came roaring out of it. It just gave me this wonderful opportunity to work, you know, in a place which, you know, I started to actually become fond of Denver. You know, I think in an earlier part of my life, it would have been hard, you know, in comparison to New York. Like, it was easier to move to Jackson Hole because there was no comparison.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it's different universes, right? And in another city, I would be comparing things. But, you know, at this point of maturity in my professional career, I just feel that, you know, Denver is a city with a very optimistic future. You know, it always do the right thing in terms of their urban planning and other stuff, but by and large, you know, I think it has a future culturally, you know, and with new generations, you know, that other places don't have. They've either, you know, overpriced themselves, you know, and I don't know what's going to happen with this whole pandemic and how it's going to jostle up and, you know, shake up the whole world of office spaces and residential spaces and, you know, suburban perceptions. And, you know, I mean, we just don't know yet, you know.
Yeah, I know. So I think that kind of takes us into our next topic here. But the one story about you that I like is that when I moved here like 5 years ago, I reached out to you guys and had some good conversations with like Doug Stalker with your firm, and and we were talking, and I had a coffee with him one time, and you came in and you were kind of talking to him, and then you said like, yeah, hey, yeah, nice to meet you, good seeing you, whatever. And then it didn't work out with you guys with timing and stuff. But a few months later, then you were on the jury of a Young Architects AIA award. Yeah. And I got one of the awards, and I was like, and I was on a real high, and I was like, man, I bet he remembers that project from my portfolio. And he's like, yeah, here you go, man. And so I saw you at the thing, and I went up, and I was feeling really, really good. And I said, hey, Steven, yeah, thanks. You know, thanks for the award. You know, it's too bad we didn't get it to work out with the firm, but yeah, I enjoyed it. And you just looked at me with like the blankest stare, like, who the hell is this guy? And it was like the moment of like high, like excitement to like grounded me right really well.
I apologize.
No.
I'm often not very good at that. In that, you know, when I connect with people, but, you know, I have a social life in New York, you know, an existence in Jackson Hole, and here's this new place, Denver, that I'm trying to understand where everybody comes from and what they're doing, and, you know, every firm becomes another alphabet name every 6 months, and, you know, I mean, you know, firms buy firms, you know, they absorb other firms, and I really do get confused.
Yeah.
And now that I'm teaching, and this is my third semester teaching in the graduate program, you know, it's like a whole new environment to learn, you know, where I've got to remember who everyone is and, you know, and not like, you know, diss somebody without meaning to do it.
Well, it was just my hubris of thinking that you would remember me, but that just leads into this idea of like of what was the moment of biggest like failure or in your career as you look back, or like that lowest point where you just whatever, you know.
Well, I think there was some anxiety in the middle of my time of only having Jackson as a practice, where I felt that, you know, I didn't want to be seen as an architect that just did houses. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
I think that as an, you know, an obligation to myself and the profession, that doing public work was very important to me, you know, and the place got smaller and smaller and closed in on me, you know, and I felt lost. And then the crash happened, you know, although I had sort of started to engineer the Denver, opening up the Denver office in '07, you know, not much happened before the crash. And then I was kind of like there in a place that, you know, I don't ever like to disrespect Jackson Hole, because it's a beautiful place. And, you know, there's a lot of really interesting people there, but, you know, it has limited cultural options, you know, just by size, right, and proximity to other places. And, you know, I would think that was my low point in feeling, you know, a little desperate.
Yeah. I see that.
And then the recession. I mean, the you know, the Great Recession. You know, talk about feeling, you know, like I can't. You know, I'm not sure I'm going to make it through this. You know, and I had all kinds of things going on. I had purchased a building for my office on a piece of property overlooking the town of Jackson, like in the end of '07, and then it was worth like half the, you know, of what I paid for it, right? And I had like an obscene mortgage and had to come up with interesting ways of, I figured out with a friend of mine how to interpret the town's regulations to allow for a variant of live work, and then get the bank. I convinced the bank to lend me money more than what I already owed them, you know, to like build a fourplex, you know, and it worked out. I built you know, and I managed to work myself out of it. But, you know, at the same time, you know, you're worried about payroll, and, you know, how quickly do you need to get rid of people, and, you know, the torment of doing that, right? I mean, that was a low point. I mean, that was a, you know, a real, really like painful period that, you know, I was already starting to get a little, you know, just closed in feeling, and you know, now it actually makes me like both places even more. It's the contrast and you know, the diversity of being able to go to that place and still have an active practice and you know, client base, and I'm, you know, I serve on art boards in Jackson Hole, and there's 7 people there and 7 people here, and, you know, that's like the maximum that I would really ever like to have. And, you know, because I came from the SOM design department, you know, the DNA of the firm has always been, you know, very rigorous about design, schematic design and development, you know, and not that I have, you know, any less regard for the science of architecture. I certainly do, and I think that that's what makes it unique and torturous, is that, you know, a sculptor doesn't have to make it,
Yeah.
you know, not leak.
Yeah.
You know, so you know,
Have
I mean,
wheelchairs.
the thing that ultimately always intrigued me is just that breadth of what we do as private practitioners, you know. And to go into private practice, you don't really know what you're going into, and you're learning it step by step, right? And you don't, I mean, the things you have to confront, you know, the learning the business of doing it without a business degree, you know, and understanding enough about the finances. You know, all I know is that some money comes in from this side, I grab a little bit off, and it goes out the other side. That's the way.
Yeah. Hopefully you can grab some, and yeah.
You know, and you know, but the sort of pride of knowing that I could get as engaged in a technical problem on a project, as I can a conceptual problem, or challenge or opportunity, has always been the thing that will eternally motivate me in architecture. I'll never retire. I'll just collapse somewhere. But
yeah, a good architect.
Hopefully
not in the bus station of the
No, exactly.
not
But,
a con.
I'll say this. So being a leader in design, the other thing about having private practice is that, you have a responsibility to your people, that they have fulfilling experiences, and that you treat them as equals, and I've always had a fairly egalitarian office, early on, I sort of insisted on doing all the conceptual design. I kind of bogarted it a little bit. I always had, 10 things I wanted to explore, right? And as I matured, I consider myself a design director and founder of my office, but, I both initiate and create designs as well as enable other people to do it, and feel more warmly able to interact with the staff and make them feel fulfilled, that they're really being able to do the things they want to do, and give them that regard and recognition. So that has become very important to me because it speaks to the health of an office, and the degree of turnover, or the whatever one confronts. They're a good office with people that you treat well is something to cultivate.
Yeah, because like you're saying, it's the profession can take so much away from you, right? And it's so difficult, and to have those high moments, even when you're working under somebody or whatever, So what if you had to say what was the mountaintop moment? Have you had a moment where you just like stand back and say, man, this is all worth it. This is the time.
Well, yeah. So the first major house that I, there were a number of high points, right? So, I had times at SOM where, I was recognized by associate partner for, coming in the office 7 days a week for 3 months for 12-hour days.
Thank you. Yeah, right.
Doing a lot of schemes. But certainly the first house that I did in Jackson, I was so terrified that it might be rejected by the community and begin the demise of my efforts to make inroads and move the community in a certain direction. And when it was done, and there's that thing about architecture. I guess when people said, what do you love about architecture? I always said that, when you're thinking of a space, as you're drawing, as you're designing, as you're exploring, and you think about the proportions of that space, and you have it in your head, and you're walking through it, and you're understanding axially what are you looking at when you're entering the room, what are you looking at as you turn around, all of those things, when the building is done, to go in and the sort of, goosebumps of it sort of worked out, I was kind of right.
Makes it all worth it. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I was enough right. But I also now take that further into, to me, the most important thing about architecture is its interface with the user and its interface with the fabric of its existence, like in a city, that it is a component of something rather than a singular, effort, right? That yes, it is a singular effort, but it has responsibilities to other things, and that could mean a lot of things. It might mean you want to contrast context, or it may mean you want to comply with context or reinterpret context.
Yeah.
Or lead the context in a different way, right? But all of those things that I see, the act of architecture is slightly less of an egotistical effort. That 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 yes, it's incredible to make a building that's going to be there for a pretty long time. Although in the United States, you go to Italy, buildings are there for 1,000 years. You come here and 50 years and they're gone, right?
We ran into an hour time limit and Stephen got cut off. I had this counter coming up on the top, and it was just too good to break in on you, so I had to. But anyway,
sorry. I'll take a breath, and I will try to just finish whatever it was we started. So, where were we?
So, yeah, I think you were kind of just talking about that high point moment, and just I think the power of architecture in that. And I think just the last question would be, do you know where you're going next? What's next? What kind of keeps your blood pumping and inspires you right now?
Yeah. We travel a lot, and I really miss traveling because we normally travel extensively every year. And, traveling for me is a learning experience. So it's nonstop absorption of cultural information. And my other half is a woman who was a ballet dancer with Paris Opera ballet, and then stage director at Monte Carlo, and she now is a ballet mistress at a number of studios. But we travel well together, and I look forward to a lot more travel, but I will never not look forward to new opportunities in doing architecture. I really would like to consider, I have some furniture designs that I would like to develop and consider putting into production. And I'm, looking into what those possibilities are. But I will always be intrigued, and I think as a private practitioner with a studio that is really about design, we don't pigeonhole ourselves into a particular building type. We all know that, if you do hospitals if you do one building type, you're in that groove. But in what we do, it's a new learning experience every time because it's a new program. So I would look to branch out in doing work in other places as well.
Do you see another drastic jump in your life, like you've had the kind of 3 now of locations at least? You going to shake it up again?
Interestingly, I didn't really do those strategically. I will say that I did them as I considered early in my career that what I was always doing is slaying another dragon. I would think that going to RISD from my background in a lower middle class ethnic urban environment to a place like RISD was slaying the dragon. Going to a firm like SOM was slaying the dragon, and taking the opportunity or making the opportunity or identifying opportunities in terms of moving to Jackson Hole and then the opportunity to come to Denver. It's really, the opportunity is half of it, and your ability to identify it and move on it is the other half. So I can't really predict. There's nothing like I have a strategic plan that I will do exactly this. I mean, I think I would love to move to a foreign country and do work in some other place, but I'm at a point in my career where I am relatively comfortable in the three things I do, the two main offices with a New York, minor presence, and then the teaching has become more important to me. And I would say what I might see as a high point now and another shift is more dedication to teaching opportunities, because, at this age, I have lots of experiences in practice and in the world of architecture that have made me feel like I want to participate with people learning architecture, that I have a lot to offer.
Yeah. It's been good to have you at the school and see you in there teaching and see you around, and like I said, before I moved here, just looking around at the architecture going around, you were definitely a high point, and it's great to be able to have this conversation and have a relationship with you. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming on this new show.
Sorry about dissing you as a young architect.
Oh yeah, I need to be dropped down a lot. Usually my wife does it, but it's good to have other people that bring me down. So
yeah,
appreciate it.
This is a great little whatever you call this, architecting. Is that the name of this?
Yeah.
I think this is a very useful thing to do, to share experiences. So thank you.
Well, thanks for coming on.
Yeah.
Good talking.
Great. Thank you, Adam.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
See you guys. Thanks for listening to this week's show. You can visit architect-ing.com to see images from this week's guest. And please rate and review the show wherever you listen, on Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, or Anchor. Have a great week and continue to reach out. Thanks.
You can visit architecting.com, that's architect-ing.com, to see images from this week's guest.
And please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.
Have a great week and keep connecting.